So today's session, our guest presenter, we'd like to welcome her. Her name is Karin Swift. Karin comes from the community services. She's a community services professional and a disability human rights advocate. So I'm just about to give you some information on Karin. The bio note for Karin Swift is community service professional and disability human rights advocate, self-managed participant, National Disability Insurance Scheme. Karin has had a successful career across community, government and disability persons organisations in Queensland and Australia since the mid-90s. Karin has worked in a wide variety of roles across a number of key areas, including human rights, disability, women's issues, health and the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS. Most recently, Karin was employed at Queenslanders with Disabilities Network, QDN, for 6 years in a variety of projects and roles, most recently being their policy officer. Karin has worked internationally in the human rights space in her capacity as the president of the Women with Disability Association, the WDA, and the National DPO for women with all types of disabilities in Australia. Karin has co-authored and presented many conference papers on behalf of the WDA. Her international work includes the following. In 2016, Karin was a keynote speaker at the International Conference on the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Human Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so the UNCRPD. Promotion of the rights of women and girls with disabilities by the UNCRPD, held in Seoul in South Korea. In 2013, Karin was selected as part of the Australian government delegation to the 57th meeting of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the principal global policy-making body dedicated exclusively to gender equality and advancement of women. Karin provided advice to the Australian government on violence against women with disability and assisted to get sterilisation and other practices included as violence in the agreed conclusions. In 2012, Karin travelled twice to Jakarta, Indonesia in 2012 as part of a delegation with the Australian Human Rights Commission to co-facilitate a series of training workshops for women with disability and other stakeholders on utilisation of the United Nations Convention of the Human Rights Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD, and violence against women. Karin is passionate that all people with disabilities receive funded supports from the NDIS, have the ability to exercise choice and control about these supports and the services, regardless of how they are managed. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Karin, who is going to share her screen.
So we might just go to slide 2. Danny. So I'd also like to do a brief acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands I'm speaking to you from today in Brisbane, but I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which each of you are living and working and learning from today. As we share our knowledge of teaching and learning, may we also respect traditional elders past and present and emerging, as their collective knowledge and experience holds the key to successful future generations. So we'll go to the outline of today's session. So I thought I did a very similar presentation last year, but I thought I would just mix it up a little bit by adding a bit in the beginning about the importance of advocacy and recent campaign work I've been involved in safeguarding the funding of advocacy in Queensland that was due to finish on June 30th. Then I thought we'd look at some human rights activities and engagement and things that I've been involved in both at the local, national and international level. And then I thought we'd have maybe just go back then. Oh, sorry. And then I thought we'd maybe have a bit of a Q&A, and then after that, go into my experiences in the NDIS and working to achieve choice and control, and just a little bit about my personal life and how that's gone. So if that suits everybody, we'll just jump into the presentation now. So the photo you can see on the screen is a photo of me and Danny. Last Wednesday, we went to the Stand With Us rally where I spoke on the importance of advocacy and continued advocacy funding in Queensland. And that was in Queensland, it was a well-attended, no one's behind us, but at the front of us, there was about 200 people. And that was at Speaker's Point, just outside of Parliament House. So recently, as the head of Queensland's Disability Women's Network, I was asked to be a spokesperson of the Stand With Us campaign to fight for continued state advocacy funding beyond 2021. I became involved in the Queensland social advocacy movement in 1994 when, as a university student, I did a placement at Speaking Up For You, an individual advocacy organisation in Brisbane. Here I learned that many people with disability need support to both find our voice and speak up for ourselves. And many also need people to stand with us, as many of us are so disenfranchised by the system, we simply can't go it alone. I myself have had 2 times in my life where I've turned to an advocacy service for support. So I'll just share those now. Once when I wasn't getting a fair go from a service, a paid advocate stood alongside me to ensure I had access to information that was kept about me by the service, so I could speak up about inaccurate and vexatious file notes and set the record straight. They had previously refused to do this, and the service manager says, "Oh, but it just sits in a lock cabinet under my desk." And I'm like, what happens in 6 months when you're no longer the service manager and other people have that information? And some of the stuff was untrue, so I just felt that the record needed to be set straight. I also sought the help of an advocate to get the best outcome from my first NDIS planning meeting. So my experience in the NDIS we'll touch on in the second part of the presentation. And I just feel it's important to note here that even though I can speak up for myself and did a lot to prepare for that meeting, that first planning meeting was very scary. And without the advocate support, I don't think my plan would have been as good. So, there comes a time in our lives where each of us need someone to stand by us. And for people with disability, that's really, really true. And I'm just going to touch a bit on gender here as well, as I will later in my paper. But just a bit of a gender perspective on advocacy. Women with disabilities, nearly 1 in 5 worldwide, experience multiple forms of discrimination that create additional challenges for our access to advocacy, participation in activism, and our everyday lives. These include barriers to accessing education, employment, and employment opportunities, as well as experiencing high levels of violence. Due to discriminatory attitudes and institutional barriers to participation, the voices and lived experiences of women with disabilities have been largely ignored by their communities, societies, and within human rights movements. Women with disabilities and their organisations are passionate, energetic and committed to this urgent effort. Furthermore, women want to work collaboratively and demand our rights unequivocally. The government can help address these issues by ensuring advocacy services remain funded and people with disabilities receive the advocacy they need and are also supported and encouraged to find their own voice and have a seat at the table. This can only be done through the recurrent funding of advocacy services. Also, for advocacy to be truly effective, it's critical that it remains free from conflict of interest of service providers. Also, it's simplistic to assume that now that we have the NDIS, the need for advocacy isn't there. In fact, given the current issues regarding independent assessment, it's critical that our advocacy voices continue to be heard. So furthermore, given the majority of disability and aged care services are now funded federally through the NDIS and My Aged Care, it makes sense to continue funding advocacy at the state government level so that people have local supports they can turn to. There are also many issues that sit outside these systems, such as legal issues, guardianship, transport, housing and health, to name a few, that still need robust and effective advocacy for people with disability to get a fair go. So there's some of the speaking notes that I spoke to in my rally sort of speech. And a conclusion to that was the night before the rally, the government did actually commit to $8 million for the next 2 years, but that's actually less than what the groups get funded now. So we'll still need to have do some work there in terms of how we do the work with less money. But our aim is to also keep advocacy recurrently funded. So we will need to keep on with that issue. So now I'd like to delve further into human rights. So the most significant barriers facing people with disability from equally accessing our community are often not the physical obstacles, but the attitudes, assumptions, and biases of the people they meet. Despite decades of policy improvements, including the introduction of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, an organisation that I'm involved with called QDN, report that little progress in changing outdated and harmful attitudes towards people with disability in our community. The attitudes and actions of service providers, businesses, community groups, governments, and individuals towards people with disability are too often based on misconceptions and archaic stereotypes. When these attitudes go unchallenged, it creates environments where violence, abuse, neglect, and exploitation can flourish. Human rights are about everyone, and they are very important for people with disability. Recognising that people with disability are often overlooked in human rights discussions, in 2006, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, the UN Disability Convention. And in 2008, Australia committed to protect and respect the rights in the Convention, giving people with disability the knowledge and the support to exercise their rights is key, not only to ensuring their safety, but challenging ingrained societal beliefs. Duty and supports human rights-based approach, in particular article rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which seeks to provide and protect equal rights for all persons with disability to live independently and be included in the community. Ultimately, people with disability are looking for the same opportunities as everyone else. Better healthcare, a quality education, a secure job, a safe place to live, and more time with the people they love. Human rights are important for all people with disability. However, I will now focus my presentation on some human rights work I did specifically for women with disabilities. I would like to talk to you about my experiences of advancing human rights for women with disabilities, both within Australia and overseas. I've had an interest in human rights since my high school. I was a high school student, and I had a remarkable young friend named Christine, who wrote a moving letter to Gorbachev that received some media attention at the time about bringing an end to global conflict and violations of human rights. I went on to study human rights as part of my undergraduate degree, and while most of the examples discussed in class were of international atrocities, I began to make a link regarding some local experiences of marginalised groups in Australia, such as women, people for whom English wasn't their first language, and people with disabilities. After university, at the age of 22, I was appointed to the second Queensland Women's Consultative Council, a Queensland government board formed by the then Premier Wayne Goss to consult on women and the law, where I headed a project on women with disability and domestic violence. I've been a member of Women with Disabilities Australia since the late 1990s, recently being given the honour of life membership and having served twice on the board as president. WIDA is the peak organisation for women with all types of disabilities in Australia. WIDA is run by women with disabilities for women with disabilities. It is the only organisation of its kind in Australia and one of only a very small number internationally. WIDA's work is grounded in a human rights-based framework which links gender and disability issues to a full range of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. This rights-based approach recognises that equal treatment, equal opportunity and non-discrimination provide for inclusive opportunities for women and girls with disabilities in society. It also seeks to create greater awareness among governments and other relevant institutions of their obligations to fulfil, respect, protect and promote human rights, and to support and empower women with disability, both individually and collectively, to claim our rights. Through WIDA, I've learned so much about my identity, not just as a person with a disability, but as a woman with a disability. Gender is one of the most important categories of social organisation, yet people with disabilities are often treated as asexual, genderless human beings. WIDA believes that this view is borne out in Australian disability policies, which haven't applied a gender lens. Most have proceeded as though there is a common set of issues and that men and women experience disability in the same way. However, women with disabilities and men with disabilities have different life experiences due to biological, psychological, economic, social, political, and cultural attitudes associated with being female and male. Patterns of disadvantage are often associated with the differences in the social position of women and men. These gender differences are reflected in the life experiences of women with disability and men with disability. Women with disability face multiple discrimination and are often more disadvantaged than men with disabilities in similar circumstances. Women with disabilities are often denied equal enjoyment of their human rights, in particular by virtue of the lesser status associated to them by tradition and custom, or as a result of overt or covert discrimination. So I'm now going to go through a few aspects that women with disabilities face. So we face multiple discrimination and are often more disadvantaged than men with disabilities in similar circumstances. We're often denied equal enjoyment of our human rights due to the lesser status ascribed to us by tradition and custom, or as a result of overt and covert discrimination. And we experience violence, particularly family violence and violence in institutions, more often than disabled men. We're often at greater risk than disabled men, both within and outside the home, of violence, injury, or abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, maltreatment, or exploitation. We're more vulnerable as victims of crime from both strangers and people who are known to us. Yet crimes against disabled women are often never reported to law enforcement agencies. We're more exposed to practices which qualify as torture or inhumane or degrading treatment, such as sterilisation, forced abortion, violence, forced medication, and chemical restraint. More women with disability than men are classified as having disabilities, particularly as ageing populations mean that larger proportions of the elderly are women with disabilities. Of all household types in Australia, elderly single women are at the greatest risk of persistent poverty, with more than half of elderly single women living in poverty. Women with disability and men with disability have different economic opportunities, with disabled women more likely to be in the paid, with disabled women more likely to be in the paid workforce, or less likely, to be in the paid workforce than disabled men. They also have lower incomes from employment than men with disabilities. In Australia, the gender gap in pay has widened over the last 4 years. Superannuation savings are directly linked to paid work, and current annual and average superannuation payouts for women are less than half that received by men. Women with disability from ethnic or Indigenous communities are more likely to have to contend with forces that exclude them from the basis of gender, as well as disability, culture, and heritage. Gender-based violence, including domestic and family violence, sexual assault, and rape, is a cause of disability in women. I've been fortunate to have many developmental opportunities through WIDA, such as going to conferences, giving speeches at women's rallies, giving papers at conferences, speaking at inquiries, and some overseas developmental and representative work opportunities, which I'll talk about later. Together with WIDA's able CEO, Carolyn from ARDA. I've met with ministers across both sides of the political spectrum, been kissed in public, and had other delicate moments where I've flown to the other side of the country to find the minister's office inaccessible. I've always wanted to be a strategic advocate and collegial in my approach, regardless of politics. I've always considered social justice and community inclusion as core to my values. But when the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into effect, I felt it gave us all an extra tool to use in our fight for social justice. WIDA uses this tool and other human rights conventions and treaties as a basis for all its work. WIDA's work is grounded in a rights-based framework which links gender and disability issues to a full range of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights. Promoting the reproductive rights of women and girls with disability, along with promoting their rights to freedom from violence and exploitation, and to freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, are key policy priorities of WIDA. As WIDA's profile began to rapidly increase around the world, the organisation was regularly being invited to travel overseas to speak, comment, add value to, and work on a variety of international efforts, as they are now widely recognised as a leading international voice and expert on human rights issues for women and girls with disabilities. To do this effectively, WIDA needed to resource its membership so they are prepared for all the unique opportunities and challenges that overseas representation work brings. I've been very fortunate to participate in overseas representative opportunities in 3 countries for WIDA over the years. These included, in 2016, I was a keynote speaker at the International Conference for the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, the UNCRPD, promotion of the rights of women and girls with disability by the UNCRPD, held in Seoul, South Korea. This was an international conference comprising of participants from around the world, including Australia, China, India, Italy, Japan, Germany, Korea, Malaysia, Mongolia, Nepal, the Philippines, Thailand, USA, and Vanuatu. I delivered a keynote presentation on behalf of WIDA on the status of human rights for women with disabilities, women and girls with disabilities in Australia. The international conference provided an opportunity to reflect on the first 10 years of the CRPD, and particularly how Article 6, Women and Girls with Disabilities, and other relevant articles of the UNCRPD have been implemented at the national, regional, and international level, and have changed the lives of women with disabilities. I felt privileged to be able to attend and speak at this International Human Rights Conference for women with disabilities. It was an amazing experience to connect with women with disabilities around the world and share our stories, understandings, and struggles of fighting for and maintaining human rights. While each of us had different backgrounds and came from countries that may have had different cultural, political, or social understanding of disability, it was heartening to see that internationally The advocacy movement is fierce. There is strong leadership by powerful women speaking of issues with wisdom, passion, and a collective voice. Despite our differences, each country spoke to similar issues in their presentations, with issues such as violence and freedom of sexual identity being key issues for women with disabilities worldwide. The understanding that human rights were universal and unequivocal was common knowledge among the group. I came away from the conference energized in mind and spirit, ready to share my knowledge and use what I'd learned in my local community and network. In 2013, I was selected as part of the Australian government delegation to the 57th meeting of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, more commonly referred to as CSW. The principal global policy-making body dedicated exclusively to gender equality and the advancement of women. This trip to New York in 2013 was perhaps the highlight of my life to date. Spending 16 days there, I began to feel like a local, and even had a local bar that I frequented for meals and liquid refreshments. We were able to enjoy almost all the sights and sound of New York had to offer. Access around the New York City and the UN buildings was a challenge, but we absolutely loved every minute of it. My main role there was to provide advice to the Australian government on violence against women with disability. I was always also able to assist to get sterilisation and other practices included as violence in the agreed conclusions. This was a big win. It was interesting to see how agreements around language occurred under a consensus model at the UN. At times, it became a tedious process, especially the conjecture around the inclusion of lists of specific groups of women, usually marginalised and vulnerable women. The days were long and I had to make certain decisions around my stamina, but I did my best to ensure I attended a good deal of the negotiations. We managed to get a specific paragraph on disability in the agreed conclusions. This was to take all appropriate legislative and administrative, social, education and other measures to protect and promote the rights of women and girls with disability, as they are more vulnerable to all forms of exploitation, violence and abuse, including in the workplace, educational institutions, the home and other settings. This paragraph was good as it made specific mention of the fact that women and girls with disabilities are more vulnerable to violence and acknowledges the different settings women and girls experience violence in, and that violence has a broader context than just domestic and family violence. Another highlight is getting women and girls with disabilities mentioned in a paragraph about violence in healthcare settings and how this made specific mention of sterilisation being a form of violence against women and girls with disabilities. This was a particularly emotional moment for me. I had tears running down my face as the paragraph was passed, as I was told mention of sterilisation and women and girls with disabilities would probably never happen. This was one of the small number of paragraphs in the document where the use of lists was undisputed. As women's work is grounded in human rights framework, it was an awesome experience to go to the UN to see how this framework is developed. It was also an excellent developmental experience for me to speak publicly, representing WIDA at such a high level international human rights forum. It was also a good opportunity to raise WIDA's profile. It was also a good opportunity to raise WIDA's profile, not just as a disability peak, but as a women's peak and human rights peak, in working with government and alongside other NGOs representing women's interests. So onto my earliest representation opportunity. In July 2012, I travelled as part of a delegation of the Australian Human Rights Commission to Jakarta, Indonesia, to co-facilitate 6 days of training with women with disabilities and other relevant stakeholders on the CRPD, returning for follow-up work in December 2012. I was invited in July 2012 in my capacity as board member of WIDA to deliver 6 days of training on the CRPD, with particular reference to eliminating all forms of violence against women with disabilities. This was an amazing opportunity to connect with emerging and established women with disability leaders in Indonesia. The women leaders were keen to learn how they could use the CRPD to achieve human rights for women with disabilities. Some of this work was confronting, however, as people talked with great shame about how women with disability were shackled. This wasn't just a practice in closed systems, but often a last resort for families with no support who were desperate to protect their daughters from rape, violence, assault, or murder. Families and women with disabilities talk with much shame of their experience, saying that things must be much better in Australia. They were shocked to learn of restricted practices legislation in Australia used to restrict people's freedom of movement. I was honoured to be invited back in December 2012. This time I was accompanied by the then Disability Discrimination Commissioner of Australia, Mr. Graham Innes. The purpose of the visit was to speak at 2 events, a seminar on violence against women with disabilities and a commissioner roundtable discussion. I took the opportunity to connect with some of the women with disability I met during my first visit. It was also wonderful to see and reflect on the advances made in relation to understanding human rights for women with disabilities between the first and second visit. So I'd like to now segue the conversation to what these global human rights mean for the NDIS participants. So the NDIS legislation is clear in its objectives for participants to have both choice and control in the services they receive, and as well as social and economic participation. So these tenets are also reflected within the principles and articles of the CRPD. So I'd like to take you now on a brief journey of my life before the NDIS. I was receiving accommodation support services from a large service provider alongside my husband. So this was the same service provider that I'd been connected to since my diagnosis when I was just 2 years old. My parents trusted this service, as I did, and we were convinced that sticking with a service with a long history of supporting people with my same disability and a large team of staff was the most secure option. I've lived in my own home since I was 22 years old, and I'm now 48, and I had daily support to live on my own, in my own place from a large support provider until the NDIS became available in my area. While my family and I had built a lifetime of trust in this service, I began to see cracks in what they have to offer. When I began using the service for my care needs after leaving home, it was aiming to be an individualised service, moving away from an institutional model of care. Intentions were good in those early days, and clients had individualised support arrangements based on their personal needs. As the need to service more people progressed, there were various changes in the service model that were introduced subtly. At first, the service region grew larger, with people who didn't know the clients taking over the day-to-day management of their supports. This led to a feeling of uncertainty among some of the clients and myself. There was also increased service of workers being shared across households. This meant that you couldn't easily change support shifts because it was going to impact on other people's service. Further changes happened with the advent of emergency workers and an on-call rostering system. The rostering system was confusing for all parties, consumers and staff. Eventually the service moved to the same site as their institution. This also rang alarm bells. These changes led to a greater number of people needing to know my business and the goings on in my house. There was also anxious moments when workers would drop out of shifts at the last minute and random on-call people who knew nothing about me or my care needs would be ringing to us in distress about there being no one to fill our shift in the next half hour. This situation worsened over a number of years and began to cause great strain. Yet I was still convinced that this large service was the way to go. Basically, I'd not been shown another way. So for the sake of security, I was willing to live in a less than desirable arrangement. This started to change with the advent of Your Life, Your Choice in Queensland, the precursor to self-managed arrangements under the NDIS. I began to hear about how people could manage their own funding and create small teams who had a vested interest in their welfare. This was attractive to me, but as I was still locked in the old funding model, I couldn't see a way out. I had a job where I was on a funding panel for the Community Living Initiative, which were funding all kinds of innovative arrangements. Yet I was stuck in a very traditional model of service myself. I'm just going to have a water break. Okay, thank you. Then the NDIS began, and I had another job at QDN where I was supporting people with intellectual disabilities to learn about the NDIS. We were learning all kinds of new concepts, such as choice and control, social and economic participation, self-management, plan management, and agency management. I began to see light at the end of the tunnel, and once the NDIS rolled out, I began to look at a more flexible arrangement for myself. I began doing some planning with a smaller, more flexible boutique service and had planned to leave the more traditional service within the first 3 months of my NDIS plan commencement. This was despite the traditional service trying to coerce me into signing a 12-month contract with them. I have now made the transition to fully individualised service where my support needs are not subject to the needs and requirements of 100 plus other service users. With excellent supports coordination in place, we've been able to create the role of a key worker who helps us recruit staff, manage rosters, and a dynamic team. Everyone who works for me may have other commitments in their life, but they work for no one else in the service. All of my workers care for me in the true sense of the word, and I care for them, as evidenced by regular celebratory team meetings and gatherings. Last year, we had a combined birthday party and baby shower for 2 workers. Everyone came to share in this joyous occasion. Such events would have been frowned upon in the previous traditional service, as it would have been interpreted that boundaries were being crossed, and as workers and family members were also in attendance, this would have been seen as a no-no, with the service even calling signing insurance as an issue. Basically, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that through the NDIS, despite a lot of fear on my part about leaving the traditional service, I've been able to create a truly individualised, flexible arrangement that suits me and my family. Since last year, we've also used a combination of hiring workers through the service as well as independent contractors. This has also enabled more flexibility for individual workers and myself. So my dad was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease last year, and I'm now using some of my support to spend time with mum and dad most weeks and go on little outings. In fact, just today, Danny and I went over to their house to share a bit of Easter celebration with them. This is a totally legitimate use of my support and assists me to fulfill my role as a caring daughter to my aging parent and create meaningful relationships and memories with them. Yet this would have been frowned upon by the traditional service, with them stating that my parents needed to use an ACAT package for this type of thing. My point is that all people, regardless of how their supports are managed, should be able to create these arrangements. I want to be very clear that I'm not self-managing my supports. I'm actually plan managed, but in a completely flexible arrangement that I've designed for myself. This should be the right of all NDIS participants, regardless of how they're managing their supports. The point of my story is that this situation is what is right for me. This is the vision I've developed for my life and what I wanted to create. An individual model of support that is unique to me in my life. I wanted my workers to understand and value where they work was my home. And in my home, I have traditions, rituals, and celebrations. Prior to the NDIS, I never had the choice or control to create this. I needed to fit with what the service provided. I needed to adjust. In closing, it's important for everyone to be aware that I'm not saying my model is right for everyone, but it's what's important is that everyone has the choice in control to create the individualised model that works best for them and their lifestyle. This can be whatever works for the individual, but they have the right to choose what that is. So now, crossing fingers and toes, I want to share with you a video that was last year on our support workers' baby shower. And this little man sometimes actually makes a guest appearance in my home, and I've gone through a lot of personal change this year, and I actually call this little man the youngest mental health worker ever working. I'm probably, breaking some child labour laws, but that's okay. I will now get Danny to start the video. Oh no, ooh. Let's just, here we go. We just had the topic. She was strong enough to let me go. There's nothing you can do that will change her life. When the world comes crashing down, her love will pull you through. There's nothing you can say that will take her love away. Through the heartache and the pain, with her love still remain. Her love is gonna shine through everything. There's nothing in the world like the 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 18. She feels everything. Because I come